I still remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It was the kind of night that still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even as I sit here telling you this. I don't know why I'm telling this now. Maybe it's because after all this time, I still can't make sense of it. But whatever the reason, I hope sharing it might make me feel better, or at least make sense of the horror that unfolded. It all started when I was driving home late one night. I had been visiting a friend out of state, and I had to take a long, winding road through the middle of nowhere to get back. I wasn't a fan of driving at night, but the thought of being stuck in a motel with nothing to do but stare at the walls didn't appeal to me either. So I decided to brave the empty roads and head home. It was a quiet stretch of highway, the kind that looks like it could go on forever. The trees were thick on either side, and the only sounds were the hum of my car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours, and the feeling of isolation was starting to sink in. I checked the time, 1:47 a.m. That's when it started. A strange noise from the woods on the left side of the road caught my attention. It sounded like something moving through the trees, something large. My heart started to race, and I instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind me was still empty. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't just some animal making noise in the woods. I pressed on the gas a little harder, trying to speed up, hoping to get out of whatever strange feeling was creeping into my bones. As I rounded a bend, I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was a person standing at the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, swerving slightly to avoid hitting whoever it was. I had no idea why someone would be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't want to take any chances. The figure didn't move as I approached. It just stood there, perfectly still in the dark. My headlights illuminated it for a moment, and I could see that it was a man. He was tall, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind. His face was shadowed, but I could see that his posture was strange, almost like he wasn't standing, but hovering just above the ground. I rolled my window down a little, just enough to speak, but not enough to get too close. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The man didn't even flinch. He just stood there, motionless. A wave of unease washed over me, and I decided it was best not to stick around any longer. I slowly started to drive past him, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, expecting him to suddenly rush at my car or scream or something. But nothing happened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and continued down the road, my heart still pounding. But that's when it hit me. The feeling that I was being watched. The same feeling that I'd tried to ignore before. This time it was stronger, more pronounced. I glanced around. No one was there. But then, as I looked up ahead, I saw something else. A pair of headlights far off in the distance, coming toward me at a rapid pace. I figured it was another car, maybe someone else who had taken this road and was headed in the opposite direction. But as the headlights grew closer, I started to notice something strange. The car wasn't like any I had ever seen. It was old, like from the 1950s or something. The headlights were bright, but there was something off about them. They didn't look like regular headlights. They were too white, too harsh, almost like they were glowing. I tried to tell myself it was just an old car, maybe a classic or a restored vehicle, but the closer it got, the more I started to feel uneasy again. It wasn't just the strange appearance of the car, it was the way it moved. The car was speeding toward me, but there was no sound, no engine noise, no tires on the pavement. It was as if it was gliding, hovering, just like the man back there. My hands tightened around the steering wheel and my foot hovered over the gas pedal, ready to slam down on it if I needed to speed away. I could feel my heart racing again, faster than before, and my mind was screaming at me to get out of there. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from earlier, but there was nothing. The headlights kept getting closer and closer, and I could see the outline of the car now. It wasn't just an old car, it was a hearse. A black, glossy hearse, its body shining under the moonlight, the kind you'd see in old horror movies. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stop, but I was too scared to pull over. I didn't know what would happen if I did. I just kept driving, hoping that somehow the car would pass, that maybe I just imagined the whole thing. But the car didn't pass. It stayed right behind me, its headlights glaring into my rearview mirror, impossibly close. I could see the faint reflection of the car in my mirror, and that's when I noticed something else. There was no driver. The front seat of the hearse was empty. But the car kept moving, following me, not an inch of space between us. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing the pedal as far as it would go. My car shot forward and the hearse kept up, right behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep this up. I was on the edge of panic, my mind screaming for me to stop, to find safety. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the hearse was gone. The headlights vanished, and the sound of its engine, the sound I hadn't even heard, faded into the night. I looked in the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The road was empty, just like it had been when I first started driving. I kept driving, barely able to keep my hands on the wheel, my mind a chaotic mess. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours later, my body trembling from the adrenaline. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: I was being hunted. The strangest part? When I told the locals about the incident, they all seemed to know exactly what I was talking about. "You saw the hearse, didn't you?" one of them asked, like it was a common occurrence. They told me that there were rumors of a ghostly driver who roamed those roads at night, a spirit of someone who had died long ago, looking for lost souls to carry away. But no one could explain the man I had seen standing by the side of the road. To this day, I don't know if what happened was a supernatural encounter or just a freaky coincidence. All I know is that I'll never drive those roads again. And I'll never forget the sound of that eerie silence and the feeling of being followed. Because in the middle of nowhere, sometimes it's not just the road that's empty.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. A few friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd all heard of the beautiful, isolated spots far off the beaten path, places where you could escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. The plan was simple: hike, camp, and enjoy some time away from everything. We found a remote area in the mountains of Northern California, far off the main roads. It was one of those places so hidden that most locals didn't even know it existed, except for the old-timers who avoided it. But that only intrigued us more. We didn't think much of it. In fact, we were excited. No cell service, no distractions, just the wilderness. We piled into 2 cars, packed our gear, and made the long drive. The sun was setting by the time we reached the area, casting long shadows across the trees as we pulled off the road. The forest was dense, and the air had a heavy, almost oppressive stillness to it. We set up camp quickly, joking and laughing, oblivious to the growing discomfort that seemed to settle over the land. By the time the campfire was crackling, the sky had turned black, and the stars shone brighter than anything we'd ever seen. It should have been the perfect night, but there was something off. After a few drinks and some ghost stories around the fire, we all settled into our tents. I was in a tent with my friend Mark, and the others were scattered around. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest had gone eerily silent. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the leaves and the creaking of the branches above us. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. It didn't sound like any of us. It sounded closer, too close to be any wild animal. I lay there frozen, listening. My heart thudded loudly in my chest. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him awake. But he didn't respond, his breathing slow and steady, as if he were in a deep sleep. I didn't want to get up, but curiosity gnawed at me. I had to know what it was. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out, eyes scanning the dark woods. There was nothing. The forest was still. The only movement came from the sway of the trees in the wind. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking around our campsite. I don't know why, but I felt a chill crawl down my spine, a primal fear that I couldn't shake. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to wake the others, but something told me it would be better to stay quiet. I slowly zipped the tent back up and laid down, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, some kind of animal or a person passing by. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. When I emerged from the tent, the others were already up, gathering around the fire. Mark, who had slept through the whole thing, was making coffee. The air was thick with mist, and there was a strange tension hanging over everything. We didn't speak about what happened the night before. We were all too polite to bring it up, but the unspoken unease was clear. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to enjoy ourselves, but the strange feeling didn't go away. It only intensified. As the afternoon wore on, we began to notice odd things. Things that didn't quite add up. The trees here were older than we expected, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. The path we were on seemed to twist in odd ways, as though it had been altered on purpose. And most unsettling of all, we kept hearing footsteps behind us, always just behind. We would stop, turn around, and nothing. No one there. We brushed it off as paranoia, but by the time the sun began to set again, we were all on edge. We returned to the campsite, and as the evening grew darker, the oppressive silence returned. The forest felt like it was closing in on us. That night, we made sure to build up the fire high, its flames dancing fiercely against the encroaching dark. But no matter how bright the fire burned, it felt like the shadows just outside the circle of light were too deep, too full of things we couldn't see, things we didn't want to see. Around midnight, I woke again, but this time it wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was a voice, a faint whispering, just outside the tent. I sat up, straining to hear. The voice was low and soft, but unmistakable. "Get out!" The words chilled me to the bone. I held my breath, my pulse thudding in my ears. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, whispering just outside the tent. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I waited for what felt like an eternity, the whispering continuing, growing more insistent. "Get out! Now." I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stay in that tent. I unzipped it slowly, my eyes scanning the dark woods outside. The fire was just a faint glow in the distance now, and the night was thick with shadows. The voice stopped. Silence. A cold wind blew through the trees, and I stepped out, my feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. I called out to my friends, but no one answered. I turned around, and the camp was deserted. The tents were gone, the fire extinguished. There was nothing but the vast emptiness of the forest surrounding me. My heart raced, my mind spiraling into confusion. Had everyone left? Had they been taken? I stumbled through the woods, calling their names, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard something. A soft, mournful sound, like a distant wail, something lost and hopeless. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill up my spine. I turned, looking behind me. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and pale. Its face was hollow, eyes sunken and dark. It didn't move, just stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. I froze in place, too terrified to scream, too paralyzed to run. The figure tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, and then began to move toward me. Its feet didn't touch the ground, it glided toward me, silent and unrelenting. I turned and ran, pushing through the trees, tripping over roots, heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, behind me, never gaining but never losing ground. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch, the forest twisting in strange ways as I fled. But eventually, I collapsed, out of breath, into a clearing. I looked up, and there in the center of the clearing was a figure, another one. This one was different. Its eyes glowed, and its face was twisted with an unnatural grin. It spoke again, its voice a low, mocking whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I turned and ran once more, but this time I wasn't sure if I was running from the figures or if I was running from something worse. The realization that I would never escape this place. When I woke up, I was back at the campsite. The tents were set up, the fire was crackling. My friends were laughing. It was as though nothing had happened. But I knew. I knew what I had seen. And I knew I wasn't alone. We packed up and left the next morning, none of us saying a word about what happened. But the thing is, I'm still haunted. I still hear the whispers at night. I still feel those eyes on me, watching from the dark. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I can hear the footsteps again. Slowly, deliberately, always just behind me.
Next story.
I don't know where to start, but I have to tell someone. It's been haunting me for years. I was just a kid then, still in high school, but I'll never forget the summer night I spent in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town with no cell service and nowhere to run. My cousin Jason convinced me to join him on this weekend trip. His uncle had an old cabin out in the woods, and it was about as far from civilization as you could get. I had my reservations, but Jason and I were close, and I trusted him. He promised it would be fun, like a mini camping trip with a few friends, so I agreed. It was late evening when we finally arrived, the sun sinking below the horizon, leaving the woods cloaked in a creeping darkness. The cabin was old, really old, like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. But it was rustic, in a charming way, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace that gave it an eerie, old-fashioned vibe. The place looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Jason and his friends were too busy unloading the car to notice the chill in the air. I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong from the moment we got there. The first night was uneventful, and I thought I had just imagined the unsettling feeling. We played cards, drank a bit, and joked around by the fire pit. The place was far enough out that we didn't have to worry about anyone coming by. There were no streetlights, no sounds of traffic, just the rustling of the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. At least, that's what I thought. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing scratching noises at the door. It started faintly, just a light tapping. But the longer I lay there, the louder it got. It was almost like something was clawing at the wooden walls. I tried to ignore it, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was something or someone trying to get inside. I didn't want to wake Jason and the others, so I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, the noise stopped, but by then, I was wide awake. I didn't get a single moment of rest that night, just listening for any sounds, anything that could explain what had been scratching at the door. The next day, I told Jason about it, but he just laughed it off. "You're just spooked by the place," he said. "It's an old cabin, man. Happens all the time. Probably just some animals." I wasn't convinced. There was something more to it, something I couldn't explain, but Jason and the others didn't seem to care. We decided to hike out into the woods that day, thinking it would take our minds off the weird night. The forest was thick with trees and dense underbrush. It felt like we were walking through some forgotten corner of the world. After about an hour of walking, Jason led us to a small clearing. At the center was an old, overgrown well, its stones cracked and crumbling. I wasn't sure if it had once been used for water or if it had been abandoned for decades. Either way, it felt out of place. It was too old, too eerie, and it sent a shiver down my spine just looking at it. Jason was all over it, pulling up weeds and taking pictures like it was some kind of trophy. "Hey, do you guys think this place is haunted?" Jason asked with a smirk, looking up from his phone. "Don't joke about that," I said, half serious. "I don't feel right about this whole place." "What? Are you scared?" He laughed. It was then that I heard something. A voice. Faint, but clear. It sounded like it was coming from the well. "Help me." I froze. Everyone else was too busy goofing off to hear it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. That someone was down there, begging for help. I slowly walked closer to the well, my heart racing. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the dark hole. "What's up, man?" Jason asked, noticing I was acting strange. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "That voice?" Jason looked down into the well, chuckling nervously. "You're hearing things. It's probably just the wind or something." But it wasn't. I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." I stepped back quickly, bumping into one of the other guys. My eyes were wide as I scanned the area around the well, but there was no one, no sound, just the wind rustling through the trees. "Okay, maybe we should go back to the cabin," I said, my voice shaky. Everyone agreed, though they were all joking about how freaked out I was. The walk back was awkward. No one seemed to take me seriously. Jason kept making light of the situation, but I could see a shadow cross his face when we got back to the cabin. He didn't want to admit it, but I could tell he felt it too. Something wasn't right. That night, we sat by the fire again, drinking and telling stories, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone was uneasy. The air was thick with tension. It wasn't long before Jason's friends started hearing things too. Footsteps outside the cabin, whispers, and then, eventually, the scratching. The same scratching I had heard the night before, but this time it was louder. It was relentless. "Stop messing around," Jason yelled, thinking it was one of us playing a prank. But we all knew no one was outside. The door was locked and no one had gone out. Then it happened. The door, which had been securely locked, suddenly flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. We all jumped, and I could see the terror in everyone's eyes. The night had gone from strange to terrifying in the blink of an eye. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice rising in panic. "This isn't normal. Something is wrong here." But Jason wasn't having it. "You're overreacting, man. There's a logical explanation for all this. Maybe the wind." The door slammed shut again, so hard it rattled the windows. This time, we all heard it, the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. We were all frozen in fear. The only sound now was our breathing, shallow and frantic. Jason slowly stood up, backing away from the door, his face pale. "Guys," he whispered, his voice trembling, "that wasn't the wind." We all crowded together in the corner of the room, too terrified to move, too terrified to speak. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and then silence. I don't know how long we stood there, listening to nothing. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, someone mustered the courage to turn the light back on. We slowly made our way to the door, but when we opened it, nothing. There was nothing there. We packed up as fast as we could, too afraid to stay another second. We didn't say a word to each other on the drive home. We didn't need to. We all knew something had been there with us that night, something we couldn't explain. I never went back to that cabin. Jason and his friends didn't either. Not after that night. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that voice, the scratching and the dragging, and every time I tell myself it was just my imagination, just a weird experience. But deep down, I know it wasn't. That night, in the middle of nowhere, we weren't alone.
Next story.
I've never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought that sort of thing was for people who watch too many horror movies or let their imaginations get the best of them. But that all changed one fateful weekend when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. It's a decision I regret to this day. It was early autumn when I made the plan, the kind of cool, crisp weather that made you want to hike in the woods. I had done it plenty of times before. Camped out in remote areas, surrounded by trees, the sound of the wind through the leaves keeping me company. I wanted some time to disconnect from the world, to clear my head, and thought it would be a perfect weekend getaway. I drove for hours, deep into the mountains to a place I had never been before. I didn't bother looking up any reviews or asking anyone about it. I just wanted to be alone. The place was so remote that my GPS couldn't even find it once I turned off the main road. But that didn't bother me. I followed the trail as it wound deeper and deeper into the woods until I reached a small clearing where I set up camp. That night, everything seemed fine. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of animals in the bushes, it all felt peaceful. It was just me, the fire, and the stars. But as the night wore on, the air grew colder and the wind began to howl through the trees. By the time I finished my meal and started cleaning up, something strange happened. At first, I thought I was hearing things. A voice. Not like the usual sounds you hear at night in the woods. An owl hooting, a branch snapping, but a voice. A low, distant whisper. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it was unmistakable. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tried to dismiss it. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on me or my mind starting to wander as the darkness closed in. I decided to turn in for the night, zip myself up in my tent, and try to sleep. But that's when things really started to get weird. I could hear the whispering again. It was faint, almost like it was coming from beneath the ground. I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a coyote or some other nocturnal creature. But the sound seemed to grow louder and closer. I could hear it circling around my tent, as if whatever it was knew exactly where I was. My heart started to race. Then the whisper stopped. Silence. For a few moments, I thought maybe it had just been my imagination, but the silence felt wrong, like the world around me had gone still in a way that wasn't natural. It was then that I heard something else. A scratching sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like something was moving around just outside my tent, dragging itself across the ground. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to unzip the tent, to look outside and see what it was. But then, in the back of my mind, I thought, what if it's not something I want to see? The scratching stopped. And then, just as I was starting to think I was being paranoid, I heard the whisper again, closer this time. The words were clearer now, but they were still in that strange guttural language I couldn't understand. It was as though something was speaking directly into my mind. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Get out. The voice was so clear, so commanding that for a moment I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, like I was frozen to the spot. It was as if the voice was coming from within the tent itself, echoing through my thoughts. The cold, damp air pressed in on me, suffocating me. I could feel it, the presence, the thing outside, whatever it was waiting for me to make a move. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and threw the zipper open. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the wind moving through the trees and the soft rustling of leaves. I breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that I had been imagining things. But as I turned to go back inside my tent, I noticed something. On the ground, just a few feet away from the entrance, was something that shouldn't have been there. Footprints. But they weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. These were long, claw-like impressions, deep and dragging, as if something heavy and unnatural had been crawling around outside my tent. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my chest. It took everything in me not to panic, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, and without thinking twice, I bolted. I didn't even stop to pack my tent up. I just ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to leave. The forest seemed endless, the trees looming over me like dark, silent sentinels. But no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being followed never left. Every few steps, I thought I heard something behind me, a rustling in the brush, a whisper just at the edge of hearing. I kept running until I stumbled into a small creek. That's when I realized how far I had gone. My heart sank. I had no idea where I was anymore. I was completely lost, and the sun wouldn't rise for hours. I could feel the weight of the forest around me, closing in. I sat down by the creek, trying to calm myself. That's when I saw it again, the footprints. They were everywhere now, scattered all around the water's edge, as if whatever it was had been circling me the entire time. But the thing that made my blood run cold wasn't just the footprints. It was the shape of them. They weren't random. They led toward me. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. What was out there? And why was it after me? Suddenly, the whisper came again, this time right behind me. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not looking back, not stopping for anything. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. I finally collapsed, exhausted, disoriented, and terrified. I don't know how long I was out there, hours maybe, but when I finally regained my senses, the whispers had stopped. The footprints were gone. The air felt normal again. But something had changed inside me. I knew I had been in the presence of something unnatural. Eventually, I found my way back to the main trail. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to rise. I didn't look back at the woods as I drove away. I haven't been camping since. I haven't even gone near those woods again. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I may never fully understand what was out there, but one thing is certain, it wasn't alone. And it didn't want me there.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a family vacation, something simple, a chance to bond and escape the routine of our busy lives. My wife, my son, and I decided to rent a small cottage by a lake in the mountains. We had heard great things about the area, beautiful scenery, fresh air, and a sense of isolation that we all needed. My son Jake was 13 and always glued to his video games, so I figured this would be a good way to get him outdoors for a change. The cottage was everything we wanted, small, quaint, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by tall trees that reached for the sky. The lake was just down the hill, the perfect spot for fishing or a quiet swim. When we arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was still bright, but the shadows of the trees were already creeping over the property. "Look, Dad, this place is awesome," Jake shouted as he ran around the yard, his excitement contagious. My wife, Maria, smiled and gave me a knowing look. It's perfect, just what we needed. As we unloaded the car, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The place felt off. Not in an obvious way, but there was something in the air, something in the stillness of the trees that felt different. But I pushed those feelings aside. We had a whole weekend ahead of us, and I didn't want to ruin it by being paranoid. The first night went without incident. We had dinner on the porch, and enjoying the cool breeze and the gentle sound of the lake lapping at the shore. Afterward, we played a few board games, laughed, and settled in for bed. I had the bedroom upstairs, overlooking the lake, and Maria and Jake took the room downstairs. Around 2 a.m., I woke up for no apparent reason. The house was eerily quiet, and when I tried to roll over, I noticed something strange. The window in our bedroom, which had been shut tight when we went to bed, was wide open. A cold draft rushed in, sending a chill through the room. I immediately got out of bed and shut the window, trying to convince myself that maybe I had just forgotten to lock it earlier. But then, I heard something. A faint tapping, like fingers drumming on the side of the house. I froze. It wasn't coming from the window, but from the wall. The tapping was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight and creeping toward the door. I wanted to wake Maria, but I didn't want to alarm her if it was just some animal. I stepped into the hallway, my heart racing. The house felt colder now, the air thick with an unnatural heaviness. The tapping continued, louder now, and it was coming from the back door. I don't know why, but I walked down the stairs toward the kitchen. The house was still, save for the tapping. As I reached the door, I noticed something. The lock was undone. My stomach dropped. I had locked the door when we went to bed. At least, I thought I had. I slowly turned the handle, my hand shaking. The door creaked open, and I shined the light outside. There was nothing there. Just the shadows of trees stretching into the dark. But the tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I closed the door, locked it, and went back upstairs. I checked on Maria and Jake, both of them fast asleep, oblivious to what had just occurred. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe it was an animal or the wind or some other explanation. But something about that tapping stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. We spent the day exploring the area, fishing at the lake, and hiking through the woods. Jake loved it, and for a moment, I forgot about the strange events of the previous night. But when we returned to the cottage that evening, the unease returned with a vengeance. As soon as we stepped inside, I noticed something. The back door was open again. My stomach sank, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no way I had forgotten to lock it. I knew for sure I had locked it before we left. I walked to the door, slowly, cautiously, and found something strange on the floor. A small trail of dirt and leaves leading into the kitchen. It looked like someone had walked through the door, but there was no sign of who or what had done it. I turned to Maria, my voice tense. "Did you go outside while we were gone?" She shook her head, her face pale. "No, I've been here with Jake the whole time." "Why?" I didn't answer. Instead, I checked the rest of the house. The windows were all locked. The door to the basement was secure. Everything seemed fine, except for that trail of dirt on the floor. That night, I stayed up later than usual, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The tapping hadn't returned, but the sense of unease was palpable. I kept hearing strange noises, whispers, distant footsteps, things that shouldn't have been there. At one point, around 3 a.m., I decided to take a walk outside. I couldn't stand the feeling of being trapped in the house anymore. I stepped onto the porch and taking in the cool night air. The moonlight bathed the yard in an eerie glow, and for a moment I felt like I was in a different world, isolated, far away from anything familiar. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the yard, near the tree line, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, standing motionless, watching me. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, tall, thin, and elongated, almost unnatural in its proportions. It was standing perfectly still, and I couldn't see any features, just a dark outline against the trees. My heart raced as I stared at it, unable to move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching. I blinked, and in that split second, it was gone, just vanished. I scanned the area frantically, shining my flashlight across the yard, but there was no sign of it. I ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I woke Maria and Jake, told them we were leaving. Now, no questions, no argument. Maria tried to protest, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching us. We left in a hurry, driving through the night, heading back toward the nearest town. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind us. I don't know what it was, or if it was even real, but I'll never go back to that place. There's something about the woods, something ancient, something that should never be disturbed. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't have been there.
Next story.
I've always been a skeptic, the kind of person who rolls their eyes at ghost stories and brushes off any talk of the supernatural. It wasn't that I didn't believe in strange occurrences, more that I never believed they could happen to me. But that all changed the night I decided to take a shortcut through an old, disused road in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me, illuminated only by the weak glow of my headlights. I had just finished a long day of work, and I was eager to get home. The sun had long since set, and the only company I had was the soft hum of my car and the occasional flicker of the streetlights. I should have stayed on the main highway, but I had done this drive dozens of times before, and I was getting impatient. I remembered hearing about an old back road that cut through the forest, a shortcut that would save me a good half hour. It was out of the way, yes, but how bad could it be? I decided to take the turn. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and was lined with overgrown trees that seemed to close in on either side. It felt almost like I was entering a different world, a place untouched by time. I slowed my car, my headlights barely piercing the darkness ahead, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. But I didn't mind. It was just an old road, right? Nothing to worry about. As I drove deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, cooler. The occasional rustle of leaves was the only sound besides the hum of my engine. I rolled down the window, hoping for a breeze to cut through the stillness, but instead I heard something strange, a soft, whispering sound that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I shook it off, blaming the wind in my tired mind, but the sound persisted, low and rhythmic, like a chant in a language I didn't understand. I pressed on, trying to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course. I'd been in these woods before, and I knew that reception was spotty at best. It didn't bother me, though. I had driven this road many times during the day. I was fine. And then I saw it. A figure standing just off the side of the road, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a bush or a stump that had caught the corner of my eye. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any of those things. It was a person. A woman, standing completely still, her back to me. Her hair was long and tangled, her body hunched slightly as though she were waiting for something. I couldn't see her face, but I knew instinctively that something was off about her. I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have driven past her, kept my eyes straight ahead, but instead I found myself stopping the car, the engine rumbling softly in the quiet night. She didn't move. Not a single muscle twitched. She just stood there, like she was frozen in time. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding foreign to my ears. It was a stupid thing to say, I knew that, but I didn't know what else to do. I waited for her to turn around, to respond, but nothing happened. The silence was suffocating. It felt like the whole world had stopped. I should have driven away. I should have gotten out of there right then. But instead, I did something even stupider. I opened the door. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my feet. I called out again, my voice more insistent this time. "Are you okay?" No response. I took a cautious step toward her, my breath coming in shallow bursts. There was something about the way she stood that unnerved me. Her stillness, her unnaturalness. But I couldn't stop myself. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until I was only a few feet away from her. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, she turned. Her face was pale, almost sickly white, and her eyes, there was something wrong with them. They were wide, too wide, and completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black. Hollow, endless black, as if there was nothing behind them. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came out. It was as if she were trying to speak, but the words were trapped. She lifted a hand slowly, and I could feel my stomach drop. Her fingers were long, impossibly long, like they didn't belong on a human body. They twitched, jerking unnaturally as she reached toward me, her head tilting at a grotesque angle. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I turned and ran back to my car, my feet slipping on the wet road. I could hear her behind me now, the sound of her footsteps, a soft, dragging shuffle that echoed in the stillness. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear her getting closer, always closer. I reached the car, fumbled for the handle, and finally threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to start the engine. When I did, the tires screeched as I slammed the car into gear, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the road, my foot pressed firmly on the gas. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second I saw her, standing in the middle of the road, staring at me with those empty black eyes, and then she was gone. Vanished. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and even then, I didn't slow down. I didn't even want to look at my surroundings. I just drove. Hours passed, but the unease never left me. The whispering in the trees still echoed in my mind. The image of her face haunted me, her hollow eyes following me wherever I went. When I finally got home, I thought I was safe. But as I lay in bed that night trying to shake off the terror, I heard something at my window. Soft tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, closer this time. I sat up, my heart in my throat, my breath caught in my chest. I crept to the window, pulled back the curtains, and looked outside. There, standing in the yard, was the woman. Her black eyes fixed on me, her fingers twitching, her mouth moving in a soundless whisper, and I knew with a sickening certainty that she would never leave.
Next story.
I'll never forget the day it all began. It was a weekend like any other, and I had decided to take a solo road trip. I was looking for something different, a break from the monotony of city life, something simple, a place where I could clear my mind and reconnect with the world around me. I'd heard about a small town in the middle of nowhere, a place far off the main roads. Most people had never heard of it, and the few who had were reluctant to speak of it. But that only piqued my curiosity. I drove through winding roads deep into the heart of the country. The sun was setting as I reached the outskirts of the town, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The roads stretched on forever, the trees becoming denser as I got closer. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of stillness that made you feel like you were being watched, like the world around you was holding its breath. When I finally reached the town, I noticed something odd. There were no streetlights. No signs of life, except for a few houses with lights flickering in the distance. I parked at the entrance, my headlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I shrugged it off. It was just a small town. Nothing to worry about. I walked down the empty main street, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the silence. There was a diner at the end of the block, its neon sign buzzing weakly. I could really use a cup of coffee, I thought, and walked inside. The moment I stepped through the door, the temperature seemed to drop. The air felt thick, as if the building itself were holding something back. The few people inside, their faces drawn and pale, paused and stared at me for a moment before going back to their conversations in low murmurs. I took a seat at the counter, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. The waitress, a woman with hollow eyes and a slow, deliberate gait, came over. "What can I get you?" she asked in a voice that was too calm, too flat. "A coffee, black," I replied, trying to sound casual. She nodded and walked off without another word. I glanced around at the few patrons in the diner. There was an elderly couple sitting in the corner booth, their heads leaning toward each other as they whispered, never looking up. A man at the far end of the counter was hunched over his drink, his face obscured by a baseball cap. And there was another woman, sitting alone, her hands clasped tightly around a mug as she stared straight ahead, her expression vacant. My coffee arrived, and the waitress didn't say a word as she set it down in front of me. I sipped it, but it tasted strange. Not bad, but off, like something was missing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The longer I stayed, the more uncomfortable I became. The diner seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. It was as if time itself had slowed down. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone just continued with their hushed conversations, their eyes fixed on some invisible point. Finally, I decided I'd had enough. I paid for the coffee and stood up to leave. But as I turned toward the door, the woman at the counter, the one who had been sitting alone, looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, her expression frantic. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. I froze, unsure of how to respond. "Leave now," she whispered urgently, her hands shaking. "Don't look back. Just go. Get out of here before it's too late." Before I could say anything, she grabbed my arm, her grip tight and cold. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to me. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "No one does." I yanked my arm away and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't wait to ask any questions. I bolted out the door, the bell above it ringing loudly in the stillness. I ran across the street toward my car, the sound of my breath ragged and panicked in my ears. As I fumbled for my keys, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, too quiet at first to be certain. But then they grew louder, closer. My hands shook as I unlocked the car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut. I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. I floored the gas pedal, peeling out of the parking lot as fast as I could, my eyes fixed straight ahead. I didn't look back. The road ahead stretched on, empty and desolate. But even as I sped away, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being followed. Not physically, but something more insidious. A presence. I drove for what seemed like hours, my eyes darting nervously from the rearview mirror to the dark expanse of road ahead. There was no other car in sight, no sign of life for miles. The further I got, the more I began to wonder if I had imagined everything. The diner, the strange people, the woman's warning. It all seemed so surreal. But then, as I rounded a curve in the road, I saw something that stopped my heart. A figure standing in the middle of the street, tall and thin, its face hidden by a dark hood. It didn't move, just stood there, staring into the night. I slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding hitting it. I backed up quickly, my hands trembling on the wheel. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the figure was gone. In its place, there was a pile of dry leaves. Nothing else. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of that place. I drove faster, the panic rising in my chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustling sound seemed too loud. I was racing against something, though I didn't know what. All I knew was that the more I tried to escape, the closer the feeling of dread seemed to follow. Finally, I reached the outskirts of another town. The lights were bright and welcoming, the streets bustling with people. I slowed the car, my heart still pounding. I pulled over to the side of the road, taking a deep breath. It was over, I told myself. I had left the strange town behind. But when I checked the rearview mirror, my blood turned cold. There, in the reflection, was the same figure. Standing just behind my car, its face hidden beneath the hood. It wasn't just following me, it was waiting for me.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a quick getaway. Just a weekend trip, no more than 2 days in the woods. The plan was simple. Head out to a cabin we rented online, spend some time fishing, hiking, and unplugging from the world. No distractions, no work emails, just us and nature. My girlfriend, Katie, and I were eager to get away from the city for a little while, even if it was just in the middle of nowhere. We arrived late in the evening on a Friday. The cabin was isolated, tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the last few slivers of sunlight. The area was so quiet that the only sound you could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath our tires as we pulled up. The cabin itself looked like something out of an old horror movie. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a single light in the window that made the place look abandoned. "Couldn't be more perfect," Katie said, already feeling at home despite the odd, creaky exterior. I forced a smile, but I was just as unsettled as she was. There was something about the silence, the stillness, that seemed unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. We unpacked our bags, and as we did, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the darkened silhouettes of trees around us. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just candles and the flickering light of the wood-burning stove. It was almost like we had stepped back in time, cut off from the world. After a quick dinner, we decided to explore the nearby woods. The air was cool, and the forest smelled damp and earthy, like the rain had just stopped. As we walked, the trail narrowed, and the only sounds were the crunch of fallen leaves beneath our feet. We came across a small clearing, and in the middle of it was a stone circle, like something out of a history book. "What do you think this is?" Katie asked, bending down to touch the weathered stones. She had a curious gleam in her eye. "I don't know," I replied, brushing my fingers over one of the stones. They were rough to the touch, the surface eroded by years of exposure, but there was something strange about it, something unsettling. The stones felt cold, even though the night air wasn't that chilly. We didn't stay long in the clearing, mostly because the atmosphere felt heavy. The forest was too quiet now, almost suffocating. There was a faint sense of being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. That night, after a strange dinner of canned beans and trail mix, we went to bed early. But sleep didn't come easy. The silence outside was unbearable, as though the whole world was holding its breath, and there was something else. Something deeper, something older about the cabin itself. The walls creaked, as if they were alive, breathing with the wind. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like something scraping against wood. I glanced over at Katie, who was still asleep, her face peaceful, but the sound kept growing louder, more insistent. I sat up, straining to hear. Scratching. It wasn't coming from the walls, though. It was coming from the floorboards beneath the bed. Slowly, I slid my feet onto the cold wooden floor, my heart beginning to race. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the wood stove that hadn't completely gone out. I crept over to the door, slowly turning the handle, afraid to look behind me. I opened the door just enough to peek out into the hallway. It was empty. The scratching had stopped, but I could hear something else now, a soft whispering, like distant voices, coming from the living room. Against every instinct in my body, I walked toward the source of the sound. The air in the hallway was colder than before, and I could feel a strange pressure building around me, almost as if the house itself was pressing in on me. As I reached the living room, I froze. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the stove. But I could make out a figure standing by the window, its back to me. It was a tall man, dressed in tattered clothes, with a hunched back that made his posture unnaturally crooked. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring out the window. My pulse raced, and I stepped back, but my foot hit the floorboard with a loud creak. The figure turned to face me, and my heart stopped. His eyes were hollow, black pits. His skin was pale and wrinkled, like dried leather, and there was something about him, something ancient, something wrong. He didn't speak, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he began to move toward me, his feet dragging slowly across the floor, making a terrible scraping sound. As he got closer, the air grew colder, and the lights in the room began to flicker. I backed up, stumbling over the rug and knocking into a table, the noise loud enough to wake Katie from the other room. She rushed into the living room, but when she saw the figure, her face went pale. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, voice cracking. Before I could say anything, the figure lifted his hand. His fingers were long and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth, he spoke. "Leave." The room seemed to freeze. Katie and I both looked at each other, terrified. But something compelled me to act. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door. We didn't say a word as we rushed outside, not stopping until we were in the car, speeding down the long gravel road heading back to civilization. We didn't talk much after that. I don't know what that thing was, but I do know one thing. It wasn't human, and whatever it wasn't alone. I don't know if the cabin was built on an ancient burial ground or if it was some kind of curse, but I do know that we weren't welcome there, and I'll never go back to that place again. As we drove away, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was gone. Not in the distance, not anywhere. Just gone, like it had never existed.
Next story.
I still don't know what to call it. A ghost, a curse, or maybe just the warning that some places aren't meant for people. Whatever it was, it left scars on my mind I'll carry forever. I'm telling you this not to scare you, but to warn you, to make sure no one else makes the same mistake I did. It started about 2 years ago. My friend Ben had just gotten a new job that required him to move to a rural part of Wyoming. He asked me to help him move his stuff, and I jumped at the chance. I'd been cooped up in the city for months, and a road trip sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. We drove all day and into the night, surrounded by miles of nothing, just empty fields, mountains in the distance, and a long stretch of highway. It was beautiful, but isolating. Around 11 p.m., Ben told me we were only about 30 minutes from the place he was renting. That's when we saw it. A man, standing in the middle of the road. Ben slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop just a few feet from him. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at us. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, and he wore old, tattered clothes that looked like they belonged in another century. "Do you see this guy?" Ben whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared like he was trying to see straight through us. His head tilted slightly, and I swear his mouth started to curl into the faintest, most unsettling smile I'd ever seen. Ben honked the horn. "Get out of the road, man." The man didn't budge. He just raised his arm and pointed down the road toward the horizon. His finger hung there, shaking slightly, like he was warning us about something. "Let's just go around him," I said, feeling an icy chill crawl up my spine. Ben hesitated, then slowly pulled the truck into the other lane to drive past him. As we did, I couldn't help but look out the window. The man's eyes followed us, his head turning to track our movement. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. When we finally passed him, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. Just like that, vanished. Ben and I didn't say a word for the next few miles. We were too shaken to even joke about it. We reached the house a little after midnight. It was a small, one-story place at the edge of a forest. It looked cozy enough, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. Ben tried to laugh it off as we carried his boxes inside. "Probably just tired," he said, but I could see it in his eyes. He was just as uneasy as I was. We got everything unloaded and decided to crash for the night. Ben had a bed in the main bedroom, and I set up an air mattress in the living room. I thought I'd be able to sleep, but as soon as the lights were off, the feeling of being watched came back. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like it was coming from the window next to me. Tap, 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 tap. I sat up, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, and I didn't want to open them, but the tapping wouldn't stop. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the tapping stopped. Silence. I tried to convince myself it was a tree branch or maybe an animal, but then I heard footsteps. They were faint, but clear, crunching in the gravel outside the house. They circled the building, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was pacing. "Ben?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I got up and crept to the bedroom door. I knocked softly, then opened it. Ben was sound asleep, snoring softly. Whatever was outside, it wasn't him. I decided to check the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, and my blood ran cold. Standing in the yard just beyond the edge of the porch light was the man we had seen on the road. He wasn't moving, just staring up at the house, his face partially obscured by shadow. I stumbled back, tripping over the air mattress and landing hard on the floor. When I looked again, he was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of sleepless terror. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I kept hearing faint whispers, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It felt like the house itself was alive, breathing around me. When the first light of dawn broke, I woke Ben and told him what I'd seen. He looked skeptical at first, but when he saw how shaken I was, he didn't argue. We decided to check the yard just to put my mind at ease. That's when we found the footprints. They were deep, more like gouges in the dirt than regular footprints. They led from the edge of the forest to the porch and back again. But the strangest part was their size. They were huge, far too large for a normal human. And they weren't shaped like feet. They were more like hooves. We packed up and left that morning. Ben never moved into the house. He stayed with a coworker until he could find another place, and we never talked about it again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that tapping in my dreams, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left.
Next story.
I grew up in a small town, surrounded by endless fields and empty dirt roads that seemed to stretch into nowhere. It wasn't the kind of place where much happened, and we liked it that way. But there's one part of town we avoided, Black Hollow Bridge. Everyone in the area knew the stories. They said a woman had died there decades ago. A young bride who had lost control of her car and plunged into the river below on her wedding night. Some claimed she jumped, heartbroken, after her groom left her at the altar. Whatever the truth was, the bridge had a reputation. People talked about strange lights, ghostly voices, and shadowy figures that appeared when the fog rolled in. I never believed it. I thought it was just some spooky tale to keep kids from wandering too far. But all of that changed one night. I was 19, heading home late after a party out in the countryside. The main highway was closed for construction, so I had to take the back roads. That meant going over Black Hollow Bridge. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just a shortcut, a lonely stretch of cracked pavement lined with rusted guardrails. It was a little past midnight when I reached the bridge. The fog had started to settle, thick and heavy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the bridge's old wooden planks. Everything was eerily quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of my engine. About halfway across, my car's radio suddenly crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. Static poured from the speakers, loud and jarring. I reached to turn it off, but before I could, I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, and distorted, like it was coming from another world. "Help me," I froze. My hand hovered over the dial as the voice repeated itself, clearer this time. "Help me." It sounded like a woman, her tone pleading and desperate. I glanced around, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see anything. My gut told me to keep driving, to get off that bridge as fast as I could, but then I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, just beyond the edge of my headlights. A woman in a white dress, soaked and clinging to her body. Her hair hung in wet, matted strands over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her arms dangling at her sides. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a stop. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel and staring at her. I couldn't understand how she'd gotten there or why she was standing in the middle of nowhere. "Are you okay?" I called out, rolling down my window slightly. She didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head, and I finally saw her face, or what should have been her face. Her features were blurred, almost like a smear in a painting, but her eyes, they were black, empty voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. I panicked. Slamming the window shut, I threw the car into reverse, intending to back off the bridge. But as soon as I looked in the rearview mirror, she was there, standing right behind my car. I screamed and slammed the gas pedal, desperate to get away. My tires squealed as the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, praying I'd make it to the other side. But the fog didn't end. It seemed to thicken, swallowing everything around me. My headlights barely lit the road anymore, and the bridge felt like it was stretching on forever. And then, just as I thought I'd never escape, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in total silence. I fumbled with the key, trying to restart it, but it wouldn't turn over. That's when I heard it. A soft, wet slapping sound like bare feet on damp wood. It was coming closer. I locked the doors and huddled in my seat, too afraid to move. The sound stopped just outside my window. Slowly, I turned my head, and there she was again, her face pressed against the glass. Her black eyes bore into mine as her lips curled into a twisted smile. "You didn't stop," she whispered, her voice echoing inside my head. I screamed and covered my ears, but her voice was everywhere. It grew louder and louder until it felt like my skull would crack. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The fog had lifted and the bridge was behind me. My car started without a problem, and I sped home, shaking so hard I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But I did some research later, and I found something that chilled me to my core. The woman who had died on Black Hollow Bridge. She had been run off the road by a driver who didn't stop to help. Now I understand the stories. She wasn't just a ghost, she was looking for justice, for someone to stop and make it right. And I didn't. I left her there, just like everyone else. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear her voice in the static of my radio, whispering, "You didn't stop."